Welcome all to another talk hosted by the Plurilingual Lab speaker series, the DISE research group, as well as the Belonging, Identity, Language, and Diversity research group. My name is Alexa Ahuja. I'm a PhD candidate at McGill, and I will be hosting today's talk. And so today we are very excited and lucky to have with us Dr. Ajit Mohanty from Jawaharlal Nehru University. So thank you for being here with us today, despite the time difference. We really appreciate it. Dr. Mohanty today will deliver a talk entitled Growing Up with Languages, Implications for Multilingual Education. And this talk will address children's multilingual socialization in societies where multilingualism is the norm. And so he will talk more specifically about the three broad developmental periods that children go through, and also will call for increased sensitivity towards viewing language proficiency more holistically to take into account individuals' total language repertoire. So today, Dr. Mohanty will have about an hour for his talk. Here are a few words about our Zoom etiquette. So first of all, during the talk, please keep your video and your sound off. However, you can always react by using the thumbs up and the hands clapping features. Also, please know that the talk will be recorded and available in the Plurilingual Lab YouTube channel shortly. Now, after the talk, we will have a 30-minute discussion period that won't be recorded for your convenience. During the discussion, you can post your questions in the chat so that our moderators, Ben and Paul, will be able to share your questions with our guest speaker today. So I will stop sharing my screen right now so that Dr. Mohanty can start sharing his. Thank you and enjoy, everyone.
Okay. Greetings from India, and thanks to the organizers, the Plurilingual Lab, McGill University, and all of you joining today. I'm glad that I'm able to share this a different perspective on multilingualism. It's based on my work in India for over 4 decades now, particularly the work among the tribal indigenous people. Let me tell you that tribal is an official category in India, although I know the rest of the world likes to use indigenous rather than the tribal, but so sometimes I may use tribal, but the two for me are interchangeable. Now, what I will do today is sort of begin by describing what it means to be multilingual, or to grow up in a multilingual society, and I will share our work on multilingual socialization, drawing some contrast between the patterns and processes of language socialization of children in multilingual societies and the multilingual children in dominantly monolingual societies. And then I will draw some implications of the process of multilingual socialization in India and other multilingual societies. And particularly, I will emphasize the metalinguistic awareness as an aspect of multilingual socialization, early metalinguistic development, which I think has important implications for multilingual education in India. I will also discuss some very preliminary application of multilingual education in linguistically diverse classrooms, because in Indian context, many of our classrooms have children who belong to 3 to 5 different mother tongue groups. Therefore, one of the issues that we are now facing in India, in Odisha particularly, where I am associated with the ongoing multilingual education program, the problem that we are facing is how to bring in mother tongue based multilingual education, particularly when a classroom has 3 to 5 or more mother tongues. Okay, we know that with globalization and large-scale international migration, multiple languages actually spread across the globe, and societies are becoming increasingly fluid. However, it's my belief that presence of languages actually does not make a society multilingual, particularly when languages are used as separate or relatively isolated entities, with boundaries between them more or less impermeable. Gogolin actually talks about the multilingual habitus, which is basically the deep-seated habit of assuming monolingualism as the norm. There are others who speak about languages being used in parallel thoughts, even when multiple languages are there in a given sociolinguistic context. They are used more or less in parallel forms. And so we need to look at the kind of societies where monolingualism is the norm, and perhaps bring some distinctions between the dominant monolingual societies and the societies like India, which are multilingual. What I will do is, so what happens, when you are talking about a dominantly monolingual society with multiple languages, these multiple languages have their own context specificity in which they are used. Therefore, one would actually talk about a societal multilingualism rather than multilingualism as such. Now, the question therefore is, what does it really mean to grow up in a society where multilingualism is the norm? Actually, moving between languages, which are more natural and spontaneous, as one actually moves between people and different contexts of use of language. Salman Rushdie, the famous Indo-British novelist, actually spoke of hearing 5 languages in one sentence when he was in Mumbai. He says, that's how languages are, they occur together. So I think the boundaries between languages remain very fluid, and moving across the boundaries of languages is not viewed as trespassing into another language or whatever. So languages are actually represented in the minds of their user as holistic and integrated. Languages have their own distinct entity. They are distinct entities, and people do identify with languages, whatever language they use, particularly the mother tongue. But in spite of all that, the representation of the languages in a multilingual society are more holistic and integrated. And you never know when and how and which languages you are using. For example, I use a variety of Odia which is my mother tongue. Then I watch television programs, for example, in Hindi, in English, in Bengali, in Urdu, in Odia, and in Kosali, which is one of the variants of, or considered one of the variants of Odia language. I perform my religious rites, my puja, by citing or chanting some Sanskrit slokas, and I use some Kui and Saura, which are two indigenous languages of the people I have worked with for last 30, 40 years. And I can understand and engage in basic communication in Assamese, in Bengali, and I can also engage in some basic marketplace communication with people who speak Kannada and Telugu, Gujarati, Marathi, and also with a large variety of Hindi. Hindi is not just one unitary language. Hindi has about 38 different languages which are grouped under it for our own census purposes. The Hindi varieties that I feel comfortable with Bhojpuri, Nepali, and Maithili, Haryanvi, and so on. Given that kind of a variety of different languages with which I operate, it's very difficult for me to decide what is my level of competence in each of the languages, and how do I deal with languages? Do I know these languages? I think sometime back, 2007, I was invited by the L3 Association, the European Association of Multilingualism and Third Language Acquisition, for their annual convention, for a plenary lecture in the annual convention in Scotland, in Stirling, Scotland. And when I entered, the registration form that was given to me wanted all the participants, not just me or any participant who was getting registered, to write down what are the languages you know. I had difficulty, because I don't know languages in that sense, but I use them, So I put a big question mark, and later the Professor Charlotte Kemp, who was the organizing secretary, asked me about it, and we had a long conversation on what does it actually mean to be multilingual, and how does it matter if one has or doesn't have knowledge of languages in the typical native language, native speaker kind of view that often linguists take. Based on our conversation, later Charlotte Kemp actually wrote a paper called On Defining Multilingualism, where she brought out all the different nuances of being multilingual in more complex multilingual societies. So in our kind of a situation, therefore, I would say that multilingualism is not about counting languages. It's not about deciding whether you are a monolingual, bilingual, trilingual, or whatever. Therefore, I think what matters to us is the total linguistic repertoire with which one operates in a daily routine life activity in different social contexts with speakers of one or many of the multiple languages. So the fact that one is able to carry on the daily life activity in multiple languages, regardless of whether regardless the level of competence in those languages is important, and that's I think one has to take note of. And therefore, multilingualism is not actually the sum of specific levels of competence in multiple languages. And therefore, at the societal level, it's not just the presence of many languages, it is how these languages are placed in the society, how are they interrelated in the society, as well as in the mind of the language user. And I think what would characterize typical multilingual kind of a context is the fluidity of boundaries with languages extending into each other, languages in different domains and in the domains of use, they sort of complement each other. I think no communicative act in a particular domain is complete unless you bring in all the different languages that are needed for effective communication. Therefore, these two, the fluidity and complementarity of relationship between languages, are two, I think, to my mind, significant characteristics of multilingual kind of a context. Now, okay, in that kind of a situation, let me go to the previous slide here. Okay, now how do what I'm trying to sort of explain here is how does a child who starts with a relatively simple home language, which is not necessarily Indian condition, it's not necessarily very monolingual, because parents and family members also bring in languages in contact to their use of what one can say as the family language or the mother tongue. So children learn to communicate using languages they encounter in the sociocultural context. And as I saw in this slide, the sociocultural context itself goes on extending. So it's a kind of, as the child becomes more and more mobile. So what happens for a child is that, in the multilingual context in which a child actually grows up, fluid layers of languages are actually encountered in sort of in concentric layers, and children grow from immediate family and neighborhood communication to more local areas. So you go on extending, the child goes on extending the zone of communication as child moves out of the home and immediate neighborhood situation to local areas, to complex contexts of communication, which are more marketplace and post office, banks, health centers, where a large number of different people will congregate, and the child gets gradually exposed to it, and then again with wider regional and sometimes national areas of communication, so particularly big hospitals, travel in a train, um, or going to a major city center, the child actually encounters a variety of different uh, kind of environment and gradually acquires the proficiency, not exactly proficiency in each of these languages the child encounters, but proficiency in being able to feel comfortable and communicate in these areas. So, uh, as I said, with some exceptions, children may not show high levels of proficiency in the contact languages, but they show age-appropriate functional multilingual communicative skills. And I will show when I discuss about um, language socialization, multilingual socialization. I will briefly mention how that process actually happens. Now, children's communicative development happens at two levels. If you look at it, and one level they learn to communicate. Learn to communicate using their mother tongue, using the contact languages to some extent, with varying degrees of proficiency. But at another level, children also learn the social conventions and norms of multilingual communication. For example, where is it appropriate to change from one language to another, or from the mother tongue to a contact language, even if the child may not have sufficient proficiency in that, but how to deal with that kind of education, how to deal with the hierarchies of preferences, with multiple languages and so on. So this is the second level, learning the social conventions and norms of multilingual communication is what I would primarily be focusing on here. Now, we have studied this process of multilingual socialization in a wide range of contexts in different parts of India. I think about, say, for 9, 10 studies from north to south to eastern and western India, and a variety of different kind of context, social context, sociolinguistic context, and all that, in which multiple languages are used, and children grow up in that kind of environment. So, through this process of multilingual socialization, children attain a variety of communicative tasks, and they develop, for example, in the process, some awareness of looking at what is it that they develop when they are socialized for multilingual functioning. They develop some awareness of language varieties across different sociolinguistic contexts. Children begin to realize these or develop some idea of domain appropriateness, and the hierarchy of preferences for use of language. For example, by the time children are 9 years old in India, most children, both rural and urban children, those who attend English medium schools and those who do not, they all begin to realize that English is a more prestigious language, and therefore occupies a higher position in the hierarchy of preferences if one can manage that language. Children also learn about the functional allocation of languages in different domains of communication. That you use certain language in certain kind of context, and then a different language in different kind of context. They learn the contextually appropriateness of code mixing, code switching. When is it appropriate to bring in, mix the code? When it is more polite to change to another language because the person who has just joined the conversation may not understand that language and so on. So basically learning the social norms of multilingual communication and politeness rules, status appropriate use of language and so on. So I think children in the process of doing that may develop some proficiency in the languages, but more importantly, they learn the norms of multilingual communication. That is more important. They may or may not develop proficiency in all the languages that they come across or they encounter, but uh, they develop some kind of understanding as to um, uh, how to use the language in more appropriate ways and so on. Now, yeah. Uh, Now, what happens in the process actually, the children develop early sensitivity. So, that is one thing that I want to sort of underscore today, that the part of this process of growing up in a multilingual society and part of this process of multilingual socialization is developing a sort of what I would say very early awareness of languages. Western studies on bilingual education or even on metalinguistic development often talk about acquisition of levels of proficiency in multilingual awareness, metalinguistic awareness. But I think what I have observed in Indian studies, including tribal or the indigenous children who are relatively more disadvantaged, they show I would call what I would call a precocious early awareness of languages and how they are used. So what I think is happening is the diversity of sociolinguistic encounters by a child actually leads to early metalinguistic awareness. And therefore, what is happening if you are looking at the theory of bilingual education, I will be later coming into this question of bilingual and multilingual education. If you're, one of the things that is often emphasized in bilingual or multilingual education processes is the cross-linguistic transfer. And cross-linguistic transfer, normally one would consider it as a fallout or a result of development of high level of cognitive academic language proficiency, with that comes to a child with a certain number of years of education and so on. But I think what is happening in Indian kind of situation is that cross-linguistic, and there are some data that we have to support that claim, that cross-linguistic transfer actually is much more likely to occur quite early in case of children who are typically growing up in a multilingual kind of environment. And then, so one would say that that aspect of cognitive academic language proficiency actually may develop even before formal schooling. And that is one thing there are some studies we have shown that children who are in the preschool range, 4 to 5, 6, they seem to be showing this ability to go across languages, and to perceive, for example, similarities in even grammatical forms. For example, in one of our small studies, we showed that children, when they were exposed to multiple languages and how they are shown pictures, singular and the many forms of plural forms of the same object, and when that is repeated, children discover that there is a pattern, there is a regularity, and there is some kind of a implicit rule as to how you pluralize, even in a language which is not their own. And therefore, what we have done is we asked like a typical Burko kind of study, where we ask give a new um, name to an object, a ambiguous object, and then you have many of them, and children are able to show some perception of the pluralism markers and all that. So, and therefore, that apart, children do appreciate linguistic diversity much earlier, that somebody else may belong to another language community and therefore may or may not be able to understand you and so on. That kind of insight into linguistic diversity. And so they have a sort of a psychological readiness for a multiplicity of languages and language identities and communication. So what I think is happening is the process of multilingual socialization actually transforms the sociolinguistic synergy in multilingual societies to a psychological reality for every child. That is something that we need to consider because that's subsequently going to be important when I discuss about multilingual education and bilingual education. Now, this process of multilingual socialization is obviously very different from what happens to multilingual children who are present in societies with monolingual orientation. For example, I have one study which where we used 3 children, the siblings actually, of Odia English bilingual family, 2 boys, 12 years, 2 months, 7, 10, 7 years, 10 months, and 5, 11 they got. Now, what they show is the parallel, what we have seen, we have documented how the pattern of their language use and so on. We have documented parallel use of languages, Odia with parents and grandparents, and English with all others, including children using English among themselves. They are all, the 3 children know Odia to some extent, the varying levels of proficiency. But when they talk amongst themselves, they would use English. When a visitor comes to the house, even if the visitor knows Odia, they would use English. So it's a kind of parallel process of using Odia in certain contexts and English in others. And Odia is used only for family level, mostly social affective communication. And children obviously have better age-appropriate competence in English, whereas their competence in Odia is little lower, in the lower level in terms of their age-appropriateness and so on. Now, they do code mix when using Odia, but no code mixing when they're using English. And kind of a reluctance to go beyond the normative pattern of language use. For example, 2 of these 2 boys, they were doing some Spanish in the school as a part of their school activity. And when the parents would encourage them to use Spanish when some Spanish workers or some Spanish people visit, in order to brush up on their own Spanish, they were very reluctant. They would talk to them in English, that kind of thing. And so even we tested them for their ability to name languages, because one of the things that is happening with multilingual socialization of children growing up in multilingual societies is that they're able to quite early, as early as 2, beginning with 2, they start naming languages, because that's one of the ways in which you can differentiate one language from the other. When they are using television programs, they would say, any 2-year-old child would say, okay, this is Hindi, this is Odia, and English, and all that. We found very low level of skill in naming languages of the regular visitors to the family: Gujarati, Hindi, Malayalam, Marathi, Nepali, Odia, Spanish, and Telugu, etc. language speakers. The 5-year-old, 11-month-old girl actually named English, which languages are used by people around them and by themselves. She named English, but she was not even naming Odia. After some probe, she would name Odia. The 7-year-old child named English, Odia, and Spanish, because Spanish was the language he was learning. And then after some probe, what other languages, what about this particular uncle who visits and all that? He said Bengali. He said, okay, I'm aware of the fact that other languages people are there who speak a different language, but I cannot name them. And then the 12-year-old, of course, was able to, part of the school education also. He was able to name all the languages when he was probed and all that. So he knew. Now, I will now sort of move from that kind of a background of language socialization work and having discriminated or having sort of brought in some discrimination between language socialization in multilingual societies and dominantly monolingual societies. I would now move on to the Indian context and look at the use of language in education, and then come to the implications of our language socialization work for multilingual education and the relationship between bilingual education theory and multilingual education. India, of course, is a very linguistically quite diverse society, and a large number of languages in different contexts of use. Okay. No, our last census actually listed 3,392 mother tongues were listed, out of which they named 1,635, but the others were clubbed together as other languages because the number of speakers was less than 10,000. 10,000 would be a big number in many other societies, but Indian diversity and the large population, the census actually decides to put any language which has less than 10,000 speakers as in one category of other languages and so on. Anyway, the languages and the mother tongues in Indian situation are actually grouped under broadly 300 to 400 major languages linguistically classified. But I think that 300 to 400 languages is an underestimation, because recently a People's Linguistic Survey of India was conducted by one Professor Ganesh Devi, a language activist, and their survey, People's Linguistic Survey, actually identified 780 languages. And as some of you may know, India has 22 official languages which are used for communication between states and between the states and the center, the federal government. And Hindi, contrary to popular belief, Hindi is not the national language of India. For the federal government purposes or for the Union of India, initially only one language was recognized as an official language, which is Hindi, and Hindi in Devanagari script written in a particular script system. And then initially they added English as an associate official language for a period of 15 years, but subsequently, because of certain language issues and language conflict, the status of English as an associate official language was extended indefinitely. So you have 22 plus 1, 22 includes Hindi, of course, and Hindi as the national level language, but not the national language, by the way, and English as an associate official language, so 22 plus 1. And you have a large number of languages used in different spheres of activity. But I have, looking at Indian multilingual kind of a situation, I have talked about the multilingualism of the unequals, because the languages are very unequally treated, and the power, the relationship between language and power actually divides the society into a hierarchy, which I call a double divide situation. Double divide is actually a situation where I say that, okay, when you look at the way languages are used and the power, of languages, the privileges that are associated with languages, English occupies the most dominant position in Indian languages, followed by major national and regional languages, which are basically state level languages, including Hindi, which is spoken broadly in a number of states. And then you have the indigenous tribal minority languages, which are larger in number, but they occupy the lowest rungs in the hierarchy of languages in India. And then I have, looking at how these languages are placed in Indian society, I have talked about a double divide situation, the divide between English and major national languages, regional languages, including Hindi, a kind of a major power gap between these two levels of languages, and then a second divide between major national languages and minority, indigenous tribal minority languages. Now, what happens when you look at languages which differ in terms of the level of power and level of privileges they are associated with? Well, I have used this vicious cycle of language disadvantage as a theoretical framework to show why certain languages gradually keep being not only dominated, but keep being weakened. Because what happens is many languages, particularly the indigenous minority languages, are neglected in education, in socioeconomic use of the society, and so on. And because of prolonged neglect of in education as well as other social spheres of activity, languages become weak. The strength of languages, depends on how much they are used in different spheres of activity, particularly in education. So languages become weak, and therefore, unfortunately, our policymakers say that these languages are too weak to be used as language in education, language in official governance, languages in trade and commerce, and so on, and language of law. So what happens? There is a vicious cycle. Languages are neglected, and neglect of language impoverishes the languages, weakens the language, and that weakness is further used as a justification as to why the language would continue to be neglected. So I think we need to keep this in mind, because when it comes to tribal indigenous languages, these are the languages which are deprived of educational opportunities. The linguistic human rights of the children and the communities are grossly violated. Um, so what happens therefore in education, despite the fact that we are linguistically quite a diverse country, I think number 3 or number 4 in the world in terms of number of languages, not many languages are actually used as a language in education. And that is declining also. So what I saw here is around 1970s, 83 languages were being used either as school subjects or language of education. So in the school education, uh, 83 languages were being used in India in the 70s. But when you look down, 1998, I have figures from the government records. 1998 figure shows little more than 33 languages which are actually used as a language of, as medium of instruction, as the language of teaching learning. And in terms of school subjects, about 41 languages are used. So there is a declining uh, number of languages in education in India, which means a large number of languages remain neglected, particularly languages which are in the lower rungs of the hierarchy or the double divide that I talk about uh, are neglected. Um, so this is despite the policy, both our constitution as well as the repeated educational policies in India, and also the curricular framework which are developed by the National Council of Educational Research and Training, which is the apex body for educational planning in India, for school education planning. There what you find is they always talk about mother tongue based education, mother tongue as the most effective uh, medium of instruction. But in reality, languages are neglected. There are several reasons. I don't think I need to go into that now. So what happens when child's language is neglected in education? I'm again broadly, we have looked more specifically into outcomes of neglect of languages, but I would just sum up the findings in respect of what happens to children whose languages are absent and who are educated in a submersion process of education in a language which is not their mother tongue, large scale illiteracy and relapse to illiteracy, poor educational performance. At one point in time in Odisha, uh, there was, in the high school level, there were 91% who actually failed. In terms of if 100 children join a school, about 50 of them leave school by grade 5, 80 of them leave school by grade 10, only 20 would appear, out of whom 9 would pass the high school examination, which means sort of a 91% wastage in the system of education, which is not in the mother tongue of the children. There is a sort of subtractive language learning in course submersion programs. As children are educated in a dominant language, the mother tongue proficiency actually declines. And therefore, the government figures often talk about dropout rate. Who are the children who drop out of the school system? I call it a push out rate, because the children do not drop out. The parents do not drop the children out of school on their own will, but the system which imposes a language which is not their own, and also the cultural features of education that is offered to children, which is removed from their own lived reality, actually leads to a high push out rate. And we have some studies, and we have written about it in a lot of capability deprivation and poverty as a result of neglect of languages in education, and of course loss of diversity, linguistic diversity. And therefore, we have quite a good deal of evidence to show the damages that the mother tongue, lack of mother tongue education is having for children. Okay. So what happens to particularly the tribal indigenous children uh, in dominant language classrooms? What happens to, for example, a Saura child? Saura is one of the tribal languages in Odisha. Saura and Kui are the two language communities with which I have worked for a long time. So what happens to them? It is like, basically, if you look at observation, Bapuji here has done some ethnographic study, which shows that there is a classroom non-participation. It's a teacher-dominant classroom transaction. Classrooms as a site for identity negation and coercive relations of power and so on. And therefore, what children very often fall back upon is no understanding, but primarily rote learning and memorization, and therefore it's not surprising that there is a large-scale educational failure. So I'll just show you some photographs quickly as an example to see. You don't need any data. This is a classroom of Odia medium school for Kond's children who are Kui speakers. So the children are obviously not engaged in any substantive learning activity. And obviously, if I impose a lecture on you in a language, in Odia, for example, if I were talking to you in Odia, in this way, you would be sleeping or you would leave this meeting, So I think it's one would rather sleep if you do not understand what happens in the classroom. And it's obviously a very teacher-dominated kind of a classroom, because children really do not understand much, so they just look at the teacher and try to memorize or whatever. And this eyes of this child actually tell you what happens. The Saura child in an Odia medium classroom, this is not interesting. So.
Excuse me, Dr. Mohanty?
Yeah.
Yes, I just wanted to let you know that we're almost out of time. So maybe we can, do you think you can wrap up your presentation in the five more minutes? Would that be okay? So that we have time for the discussion period.
Okay.
If that's okay with you.
Okay. You want to take it up for a later discussion, or?
Well, I was just wondering if you wanted perhaps 5 more minutes to finish
Yeah,
presentation.
I will do that. Yeah, I will do that.
Thank you,
Okay.
Doctor.
So one is talking about, for this kind of children, one would talk about mother tongue based multilingual education. And we have had some recent initiatives in India for bringing in mother tongue based multilingual education as experimental programs in certain kind of situation, including Odisha, which is my home state, and where I have been more involved in planning and implementation of the multilingual education programs. We have also had a special intervention program called MLE Plus, Multilingual Education Plus, for in 2 languages in Odisha over a period of 7 years. So on the basis of this kind of, these are our site for multilingual education programs in Odisha. Odisha is a coastal state on the east coast in India, and these are the areas, sites in which we had our MLE Plus program, and there is a link I have given you to a film or video document on what actually happened in our MLE Plus program. These are typical MLE Plus classrooms where you can see the changes in the participation, level of participation of children. Teacher is not taking a dominant role, but is a more participative, collaborative role in the classroom. You can see smiles returning to the faces of children in a classroom because they understand what is going on and so on. So the question therefore now is, okay, we need mother tongue based education for children, and we need to have more extensive use of mother tongue based education. In fact, our policy, national education policy, which has just recently been announced, is the 2020 policy, does talk about mother tongue based multilingual education. And therefore, we need to sort of look at various concepts in multilingual, bilingual education and multilingual education. What are the relationship between the concepts, and what are the impacts of the early development of metalinguistic awareness and language awareness of children? How does multilingual education program have to change? Because one of the things that is happening in a particular, when you look at the applications of bilingual education, there are more sort of languages which are more discrete languages, moving from a mother tongue to another language to two discrete categories. In India, there are two issues. One is one does not have just another target language from the mother tongue, but one has, in some cases, 3 to 4 target languages. And therefore, how do you deal with that kind of situation, particularly in a context where languages are not absolutely discrete entities? And then the second major issue that we are facing in Odisha is large number of classrooms have children whose mother tongues are diverse. Therefore, it's quite common for a classroom to have multiple mother tongues. So in a typical bilingual education model, you foster the development of the mother tongue and then hope for a child to make a transition to the target language and learn to be more bilingual or multilingual. Whereas in Indian context, you have to use foster development of many mother tongues in the same kind of a classroom if you want children to be competent multilinguals and so on. So you have, what I observe is the programs are more effective in Indian situations. Whatever programs are so far used, effective, and there have been at least one province, Odisha is one state where there is a policy for mother tongue based education for tribal children. Again, there is a discrepancy between policy and actual implementation. But there are various different types of diverse multilingual kind of situation and multilingual education, but mostly for single mother tongue classrooms. We need to go beyond the single mother tongue classrooms to multiple mother tongue classrooms, and also target multiple languages as multilingual competence. So again, one of the issues I think is the clear distinction between that is often made in bilingual education theory between BICS and CALP. I think we it's very difficult given the early development of CALP and the sort of simultaneous development of basic BICS and CALP. The time span, that the time gap between the two is not quite the same. That is what the data shows, and therefore we need to rethink how to use a theoretical framework in a context which is much more linguistically diverse. So there are different concerns, therefore, and but one of the concerns is that is mother tongue based education only for the disadvantaged children like the indigenous children. Our recent education policy actually talks about a mother tongue based multilingual development for all children. So we would rather hope that it should be possible for India to have mother tongue based multilingual education for all children. And in doing that, we have to deal with some of the issues which arise out of a critical application of theories and concept of bilingual education. Um, so we need to go beyond using one language as a bridge to other languages, and there are several other issues. And we have been engaged in developing certain programs for multiple language classrooms, particularly using language as a resource in a classroom, trying to develop simultaneously multiple mother tongues and then develop that insight using languages and linguistic diversity as resources in the classroom so that children develop much better awareness of languages and so on. We have had some initial success, but it's probably too early to claim absolute success. There are certain, I have written about the strategies and that we are using and to what extent they are effective. I think I will stop here and hopefully we'll be able to have some time for discussion. Thank you very much.